She walked into court without showing her face, not because she was guilty, but because her faith told her to remain covered. The judge demanded she unveil. The prosecutor accused her of hiding, but her reply left the room frozen. Do you trust those who hide their soul? No shouting, no rebellion, just a woman, standing still, while the law, the media, and the nation stared and didn't know what to do with her silence. Was she dangerous, or was she the only one being honest? What happened next didn't just shake the courtroom. It changed the people watching. Press 1 if you find the story interesting. Press 2 if you find the story boring. But whatever you press, don't pretend you weren't moved. The courtroom was full before the doors even opened. Reporters lined the aisles, their cameras loaded and lenses sharpened like weapons. Spectators whispered like wind through a cracked window, some curious, some angry, all waiting for the woman who refused to be seen. The bailiff stood tall, his voice echoing, as he announced Case 207B, the state versus Maryam Hassan. A door creaked open near the side of the chamber. A soft rustle of fabric was the only sound as Maryam stepped in. No guards pulled her, no handcuffs bound her. She walked on her own, straight, quiet. She wore a long black abaya and a niqab that covered everything but her eyes. Those eyes did not dart or tremble. They moved with intention, measured, like they belonged to someone who had already counted the cost. Gasps spread through the courtroom like sparks in dry grass. There she is, someone whispered. That's her, the one who defied the order. Maryam moved to the defendant's table, placing her hands calmly in her lap. Her lawyer, an older man named Farid, leaned toward her, whispering something. She nodded once, then returned her gaze to the judge, unblinking. Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses. He was known for his sharp intellect and even sharper impatience. His gavel struck once. The room quieted. Miss Hassan, he began, you are aware of the charges brought against you under the National Security Regulation 11F, correct? Maryam spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft but steady. Yes, Your Honor. You understand that this law prohibits the concealment of one's face in federal buildings and public transit stations? Yes, and yet you appeared at Central Metro Station last month, fully veiled, refused to comply with security protocol, and resisted facial identification. Is this true? Maryam didn't flinch. I did not resist. I politely declined. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, uncertain, nervous. Judge Reynolds didn't smile. Decline compliance is in effect resistance. The court cannot confirm your identity if you insist on hiding your face. You were given opportunity to remove it for female officers. You refused. I did not refuse, Maryam replied. I said I would not expose my face without religious necessity. Being Muslim, I believe my dignity is in my obedience to God, not in my visibility to the state. The judge leaned forward. So you believe your personal belief overrides national law? No, she said calmly. I believe my sincerity outlives it. A pause. The prosecutor, a sharp-tongued woman named Delaney, stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is a simple matter. The defendant is not here to practice faith. She is here to obey law. If we allow religious exemption to override facial identification, we open the door to every criminal, every radical, every extremist hiding under the veil of piety. Murmurs filled the room. Delaney turned sharply toward Maryam. What exactly are you hiding behind that veil? Maryam looked at her. Just looked and said nothing that would make you safer. The courtroom froze. Even the judge went silent. Delaney stepped back, visibly rattled. Outside, the wind picked up. Protesters chanted behind barricades. Some waved flags. Others held signs, unmasked the extremists, security over superstition. Inside, Maryam remained still, her hands folded, her eyes focused, her silence louder than every word spoken against her. No one could see her face, and yet somehow, everyone in the courtroom felt seen. By the second day of the trial, the courthouse felt less like a place of justice and more like a battleground. Outside, the noise had doubled. Journalists now reported live from the steps, microphones trembling in the wind as slogans clashed midair. One side held banners reading "Faith is not a threat," while the other chanted "One law for all" over megaphones. Riot officers stood in formation between them, stoic, unmoving. Inside, the courtroom was just as charged. Cameras lined the back wall. Rows of onlookers filled every bench. Students, lawyers, political figures, influencers, all waiting to see what would happen to the woman who refused to remove her veil. Miriam sat in the same posture she had the day before. Back straight, eyes forward, hands clasped in her lap. Her face remained hidden, but her presence had become unmistakably visible. Her lawyer Farid stood before the judge, his voice measured but firm. "Your Honor, this case is not about safety. It is about control. My client offered to verify her identity to a female officer in a private setting. That offer was denied. She's not refusing to be known, she's refusing to be stripped." Judge Reynolds rubbed his temple. "Mr. Farid, this is not a philosophy seminar. This is a court of law, and law must answer to justice," Farid replied. "If security is your concern, then verify her with dignity. If symbolism is your concern, then this is no longer about her veil, it's about your fear." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Delaney, the prosecutor, rose with confidence. "Objection! Counsel is making inflammatory remarks." "Overruled," the judge said quietly. "Continue." Outside the window, the sky had turned gray. Wind rattled the frames. Inside, the air grew heavier with every word. Farid stepped back beside Miriam. He didn't whisper this time. He simply placed a hand over his heart and nodded at her. Then came the voice of the judge. "Miss Hassan," he said, "you've made your position clear. But I must ask again, this court demands transparency. We do not allow anonymity in the pursuit of justice. You have been given the opportunity to comply under secure and respectful conditions. Why do you continue to refuse?" The courtroom stilled. Miriam's voice cut gently through the silence. "Because my obedience to God does not pause for courtroom expectations." "And do you consider yourself above this law?" the judge pressed. "No, Your Honor," she said. "I simply don't believe the law has the right to choose how I appear before my Lord." A few scoffed from the back. The judge's face tightened. "Then you leave us no choice. If you will not comply by tomorrow, you will be held in contempt." Farid raised his hand. "Your Honor, I request a one-day recess. Let my client consult with her family and faith leaders." The judge exhaled slowly. One day. The gavel struck once. As the courtroom emptied, the reporters surged forward. Cameras clicked. Questions flew. "Miriam, are you making a political statement? Do you see the veil as defiance? Are you a symbol or a threat?" She said nothing. Not one word. She simply walked head-high steps measured through the middle of a country's confusion. That night, her face was plastered across every screen. Debates flared. Politicians gave speeches. Hashtags ignited. But Miriam remained still in a quiet corner of her cell, reciting the same verse over and over. "Indeed, my prayer, my sacrifice, my life, and my death are for Allah, Lord of the worlds." Qur'an 6:162. And as the city raged around her, she prepared for the moment where faith would meet fire. The walls of the holding cell were white but not clean. They were smeared with fingerprints, evidence of others who had waited here for a verdict or for silence. Miriam sat on the thin mattress, legs folded, Qur'an pressed against her lap like a shield. There were no cameras here, no reporters, no slogans, only her breath and the low hum of fluorescent lights. And yet it was here, away from the shouting world, that the war intensified. It wasn't the law she feared, not the sentence, not even the possibility of prison. It was something deeper, quieter, harder to name. The test of still being sincere when no one is watching. She closed her eyes, and the memory came like a soft breeze through locked windows. She was 9, walking beside her mother through a crowded marketplace. The hijab was still new to her, slipping uneven, tied with clumsy fingers. Her mother noticed the discomfort, knelt beside her, and whispered, "What we cover, we protect. What we protect, we honor." A man had shouted at them then, "This is America," but Miriam remembered more the way her mother smiled and took her hand, unbothered, rooted. That was the first time Miriam had realized that a woman could be invisible to the world and still luminous in the eyes of God. The second memory came years later. University debate club. She was 19, seated across from a professor who challenged her in front of hundreds. How can a woman in a veil claim freedom? She had looked up from her notes and answered simply, "Freedom isn't measured by how much skin I show. It's measured by who I choose to show myself to." The applause was polite. But it wasn't until after the event when a tearful Sikh woman approached her in private and whispered, "Thank you for saying what I've never had the courage to," that Maryam knew she was carrying something heavier than cloth. She opened her eyes. Back in the cell, present. A knock at the door. A female guard entered, not unkind but curious. She sat on the bench across from her, arms crossed. "You know you could end this tomorrow," the guard said. "Just lift it for 30 seconds, just to prove you're not hiding anything." Maryam looked at her calmly. "I'm not hiding anything that threatens you, but I am protecting something that belongs to me." The guard tilted her head. "Like what? My submission?" A pause. The guard sighed. "You're willing to go to jail for that?" Maryam smiled softly. "I'm not afraid of prison. I'm afraid of disappointing the one who set me free." The guard stood up, clearly unsettled, and left without another word. Later that night, in another part of the courthouse, a young journalist named Ezra sat at his desk replaying Maryam's testimony from the first day. Over and over. Her voice was firm, her posture calm, but it was her silence that disturbed him most. It was the kind of silence that exposed noise. He pulled up her file again, read her background, her academic record, her years of community work. The fact that she had no criminal record, no history of activism, no radical associations, just a woman with a cloth on her face and steel in her spirit. Ezra stared at her photo. Just eyes, nothing more. But somehow, it was the most human image he'd ever seen. The third day of trial began without fanfare. There were no chants outside, only tension hanging like fog across the steps of the courthouse. The crowds had grown, but they no longer jeered. They watched. The spectacle had become something else, a reckoning they didn't know they were part of. Inside, the courtroom felt tighter. Even the judge's robe seemed heavier, his face more drawn. The cameras blinked silently from the back wall, waiting to catch a moment worth headlines. Maryam rose to speak. For the first time, she stood before the court, still veiled, still calm, and prepared to give her testimony. Her voice was low but firm. It didn't ask for attention. It demanded stillness. "I did not come here to challenge your laws," she said, eyes fixed on the judge. "I came here because your laws challenged my dignity." No one moved. "I am not here to provoke," she continued. "I am not hiding a weapon. I am not hiding a message. I am not hiding a crime. I am simply covering what I believe belongs first to God." The prosecutor shifted in her seat, preparing to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. "Let her speak." Maryam nodded in thanks, then turned, slightly facing not the judge but the room. "I've been asked many times, why do you cover your face? What are you afraid of? But the better question is, why are you so afraid of not seeing me?" The room tightened. "You fear what you can't label, what you can't define. But my face is not my identity. My silence is not my guilt. My veil is not your enemy." She paused. "In a world where women are sold images of themselves and told to chase visibility as value, I chose another path. I chose to be known to my Lord before being seen by the world." Her voice grew softer but somehow more forceful. "You ask me to uncover to prove that I'm honest. But I ask you, has every unveiled face ever spoken you the truth silence? You demand that I remove my cloth to earn your trust? But what have you removed to earn mine?" People shifted in their seats. The rhythm of her words wasn't that of a protester. It was that of someone who had already won something no court could grant. Finally, she turned back to the judge. "You say I must show my face in a courtroom of truth. But truth isn't in skin, it's in sincerity. And sincerity, Your Honor, cannot be legislated." Even the journalist stopped typing. Maryam bowed her head slightly, not in shame, in completion. "I will not remove my niqab, not because I hate this country, but because I love something more than comfort, more than acceptance, more than safety." She looked directly at the judge. "I love the right to worship the one who made me, without apology, without disguise, without shame." She stepped back. The courtroom held its breath. Not a soul moved. Then slowly, deliberately, the judge leaned forward. His voice was quieter than it had been all week. "Miss Hassan, what do you see when you look at us?" Maryam looked at him, eyes unblinking. "A people afraid of shadows," she said, "when what they need is light." No one clapped. No one had to. The echo of her words filled the room, and for the first time, it wasn't her they were looking at, it was themselves. Recess was called, but no one really left. The courtroom emptied into hushed hallways and half-finished coffee. Judges retreated to chambers, journalists whispered into microphones, and security guards leaned a little less stiffly against the walls. The roar of public outrage had begun to crack, not with a scream, but with a silence no one knew how to explain. Mariam was escorted into a side hallway lined with high windows. The light outside had softened. Protesters were still out there, but the shouting had dulled to murmurs, like even the wind was listening now. She sat on a wooden bench, her hands still her back straight, a quiet figure in black, faceless to the world but no longer invisible. And that's when she saw the girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Light curls peeked out from under a knitted hat. She stood behind the glass partition across the hallway, holding the hand of a young court clerk, perhaps her older sister. The child stared at Mariam with wide, unblinking eyes, her head tilted with innocent curiosity. Mariam turned her gaze gently toward her and offered the smallest nod. The little girl smiled genuinely brightly and whispered through the glass, "You look like a princess." Mariam blinked, not because the words were strange, but because they felt like something from a world that existed before law and politics, before fear had language. A princess. No fear, no suspicion, no question of identity or legality. Just a child's heart making sense of mystery with wonder, not judgment. Mariam placed her hand softly on her chest, returning the gesture with a smile that couldn't be seen but was deeply felt. The clerk gently ushered the girl away, embarrassed, mouthing a silent apology through the glass. But Mariam wasn't offended. Her eyes followed the girl until she disappeared around the corner. For the first time since the trial began, Mariam felt the burn of tears beneath her veil. Not from sadness, from mercy, because it was that gaze free from politics, unclouded by prejudice, that had pierced deeper than any question thrown at her on the stand. In a world that demanded to see her face to grant her dignity, a child had given it to her without seeing anything at all. She wiped her eyes beneath the cloth, inhaled deeply, and whispered softly to herself, "Oh Allah, keep their hearts pure when the world tries to darken them." Outside the courtroom, the media waited for a reaction. They didn't get one. There was no speech, no confrontation, no headline moment. Only a woman, sitting quietly, with the words of a child echoing in her chest like a secret prayer. That evening, the footage of Mariam's testimony aired in full. Across screens, her voice rang out, not with anger, but with restraint. And in one home across the city, that same little girl sat cross-legged in front of the television. She pointed at the screen and said, "That's her." Her mother looked confused. "Who, the princess?" the girl said. And in that small, simple moment, beneath the layers of policy, debate, and law, a deeper truth passed from one soul to another. No press badge captured it, no hashtag recorded it. But something had shifted, not in the courtroom, but in the heart of a child. The courtroom was unusually quiet when the final session resumed. Gone was the edge of spectacle. No one leaned forward for entertainment. Phones stayed in pockets. Even the judge's gavel struck softer this time, as if the wood itself understood the weight of the moment. Mariam took her place once more, standing as she had each day, veiled, composed, unmoved by the flood of attention. Her presence no longer provoked, not because people had accepted her, but because they had run out of ways to argue against the peace she carried. Judge Reynolds looked older today, less sure of his authority. He cleared his throat and shuffled a few papers he had no real need to touch. "We've heard testimony," he said slowly. "We've heard arguments on both sides, and we've heard from Miss Hassan herself. But before we proceed to judgment, the court has one final question." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowered, not as a show of power, but as a man reaching into unfamiliar territory. "Miss Hassan," he said, "how can this court, or this country, place its trust in someone who hides her face?" The question wasn't sharp, it wasn't cruel, but it held centuries behind it. The weight of suspicion, the fear of the unseen, the conditioning of a world that equates visibility with virtue. Every head turned to Mariam. Her hands were folded, her eyes calm, and when she answered, her voice carried no tremble. "Your Honor," she said softly, "do you trust every face you see?" The question hung for a moment. Then she added, "Do you trust every smile, every handshake, every suit, every clean-shaven man who's looked you in the eye and lied?" No one moved. She stepped forward just slightly. "My face does not make me honest, and your seeing it does not make you safe." Now her voice lowered, not to whisper, but to call the room into sincerity. "You ask how you can trust someone who hides her face. But I ask, how do we trust a world that hides its soul?" The air was pulled from the room. Even the cameras recording with their cold, unblinking eyes seemed to hesitate. Miriam stood silent. She didn't flinch. She didn't explain, because she didn't need to. The truth had landed, and it hadn't come with thunder, but with stillness. On the far side of the gallery, Ezra, the young journalist, sat frozen. He had prepared a full editorial in case things escalated. Talking points, quotes, a full timeline of the trial. But as he stared at the woman no one had truly seen, something inside him shifted. Without thinking, he removed his press badge and slid it into his pocket. He reached into his bag, pulled out a soft scarf, just something for the wind, and draped it gently around his neck. Not as a statement, not as a trend, but as a quiet alignment. He had heard her, he had felt her. And like the rest of the courtroom, he knew something unspoken had just been said. So loudly that silence was the only appropriate response. Back at the front, the judge lowered his eyes. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The last question had been answered, not with proof, but with presence, not with law, but with light. The verdict came without celebration. No cameras were allowed in the room when it was read, and perhaps that was fitting. Some truths lose their weight when turned into sound bites. The judge ruled that Miriam had technically violated the national security regulation, but he also noted that the law had failed to provide reasonable religious accommodation. She would receive no fine, no sentence, no criminal record. The charges would be dismissed with a warning. It was a compromise, a middle path. But everyone in the room knew it wasn't the law that had won that day. It was something else. Miriam stood as the judge spoke, as calm as the first day she walked in. When he finished, she simply nodded and whispered, "Alhamdulillah." Then she turned and walked out. There was no press conference, no victory speech, just the soft shuffle of her steps against marble as she exited the courtroom into the waiting light. Outside, the protesters had mostly gone. The noise had faded. In their place stood something quieter, dozens of women, some in hijab, some in niqab, some in jeans and long coats, and some with no head covering at all. They stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for her, not to chant, not to surround her, just to walk with her. Miriam nodded at them. One of the older women reached out and took her hand. Another offered her a small date wrapped in tissue. No words were exchanged, and then together they stepped forward. Ezra, the journalist, stood across the street. He didn't take a photo. He didn't open his notepad. He just watched. Something about the way they moved slowly, humbly, without ceremony, felt more historic than any headline. Later that evening, he sat alone at his desk, staring at a blank document. He couldn't bring himself to write the article everyone expected. Instead, he wrote a single line: "She never raised her voice." But the world got quieter when she spoke. He closed the file and left it unpublished. Some stories, he realized, are meant to be felt, not explained. As for Miriam, she returned home without fuss. Her case faded from the news cycle within days. Another scandal took its place, another storm. But something had shifted. In classrooms, students whispered about her courage. In homes, parents answered their children's questions about the veil with new softness. In hearts that had once only seen fabric, people began to wonder if they had ever truly seen character. Miriam didn't seek interviews. She went back to tutoring young girls at the masjid, volunteering, quietly reciting Qur'an in the early morning before dawn. One of the girls once asked her, "Did you win, Ustadha?" Miriam smiled. "I didn't come to win. I came to witness." The girl tilted her head. Witness what? Miriam looked at her and said, "That truth doesn't need volume, just sincerity." That night, alone in her room, she unwrapped the date given to her on the courthouse steps. She made dua before eating it, not for the court, not for the country, not even for herself. She prayed for the child in the hallway, the one who saw a princess, not a protest. And in that quiet, beneath the layers of noise and law and fear, the last question still echoed. Do you trust someone who hides their face? Or should you fear those who hide everything else? In a world obsessed with appearance, we often mistake visibility for truth. But what if the truest things are the ones unseen, like sincerity, conviction, and the quiet courage to obey God when no one else understands? Maryam's story teaches us that dignity isn't granted by law, nor revoked by public opinion. It's lived through the choices we make when tested. She didn't fight with anger. She stood with grace. She didn't demand to be understood. She remained sincere because sincerity before God is enough. In our lives, we may not wear a niqab or face a courtroom, but we will all face moments where we must choose between being accepted and being faithful. And in those moments, remember, you don't have to shout to speak truth. You don't have to be seen to matter. You just have to remain sincere even when the world misunderstands your silence. She was just 16, but she stood in court alone against her entire country's education system. Her crime, wearing her hijab to school after a new law banned it. They told her to take it off. She said no. She wasn't loud. She didn't protest. She just walked out and sued the state. The media mocked her. Politicians tried to silence her. But in the end, the Constitution changed. What did she say in court that stunned the nation into silence? And how did one quiet Muslim girl become the reason thousands of others could pray, dress, and live with dignity again? Press 1 if you find the story interesting. Press 2 if you find the story boring. But either way, you'll never forget what she said. It started on a Tuesday, not with shouting, not with headlines, just a folded letter in a closed door. The principal didn't look at her when he handed it to her. His eyes hovered just past her shoulder, as if even her presence made the room heavier. "Amira, I'm afraid you'll have to go home for today." She didn't flinch. She didn't ask why. She already knew. The paper was stamped with the school's new policy enacted under the country's recent Secular Identity Directive. It prohibited all visible religious symbols in public educational spaces, crosses, yarmulkes, and now most vocally, hijabs. Amira Rahman, 16, honor student, quiet, artist, daughter of immigrants, had worn her hijab every day since she was 12. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't political. It was simply there, soft cotton tied with care, as much a part of her as her voice. She stared at the letter for a long time. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge, then loosened. Without a word, she nodded, picked up her bag, walked out of the building. The hallways didn't erupt. No one stopped her. A few students looked away. A few whispered behind half-raised hands. Her best friend didn't make eye contact. The sky was overcast when she stepped outside. Wind brushed against her scarf, pulling at its edge like a question. She walked slowly, methodically, past the bus stop, past the bakery her father loved. She didn't want to go home, not yet. At the park, she sat on a bench under a chestnut tree and pulled the letter out again. Her hands were steady, but her thoughts were not. She wasn't angry, not yet. It felt more like a kind of numbness, like the world had quietly decided she didn't belong in it and hoped she wouldn't notice. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through the policy online, legal phrases, words like neutrality, uniformity, national cohesion. They were trying to erase her politely. Her mother's call came at noon. "They told me you were sent home," she said gently. "Where are you?" Amira replied. "I'm just thinking." There was a long pause on the other end. Her mother didn't lecture, didn't tell her to come home. She just said, "We're making lentil soup. Come when you're ready." That night over dinner, her father was quiet, too quiet. He looked at her across the table, his eyes heavy. "I know what you want to do, but this country is not kind to girls like you who speak too loudly." Amira didn't speak loudly. She simply folded the letter, placed it beside her bowl, and said, "If the law can punish me for obeying God, then the law needs to change." Her father stared at her, then dropped his gaze. The next morning, she tied her hijab again, tighter this time, and walked into a law office. The receptionist blinked. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Amira said calmly. "I want to file a constitutional complaint." "You're how old?" 16. The woman stared, unsure if it was brave or foolish. But Amira's voice was steady. "I don't want money. I don't want attention. I just want to go back to school. As myself." The days that followed were louder than she expected. It began with a local newspaper headline, "Teen Challenges, State Over Hijab Ban." Then came the morning news. A blurry photo of Amira walking out of the law office, backpack slung over one shoulder, scarf perfectly knotted under her chin. The media called it defiance. They said she was backed by radicals. A few commentators called her coached, but Amira hadn't said a word to anyone outside her legal counsel. She hadn't even told her classmates. By the end of the week, she had received her first email threat. It said only, "We'll see your face soon enough." Her mother saw it first, hovering behind her at the kitchen counter. The screen stayed open longer than it needed to. Her father snapped the laptop shut. "That's enough," he muttered. "We're pulling the case." "You'll change schools." Amira looked up. "What about the next girl?" His face hardened. "You're only 16, she answered quietly. "So was Mariam, the mother of Isa." He said nothing after that. At school, the silence was worse than the insults. Her desk sat empty. Her best friend Eva avoided her in the hallway. When Amira finally texted her, "Did I do something wrong?" the reply came slow. "I just can't be seen with you right now. My parents said it's too political." Political? That word followed her now. Not kind, not Muslim, not student, just political. Her legal representative, a retired constitutional attorney named Mr. Keller, met with her twice a week. He was gentle, sharp-eyed, and always carried a folder full of highlighter-streaked documents. "You're going to get pushed hard," he warned one afternoon. "They're not just afraid of your case. They're afraid of what it says about them." Amira folded her arms. "Then they should read the Constitution?" He smiled faintly. "They wrote it, but they didn't think of you when they did." One night alone in her room, Amira prayed long into the silence. The wind tapped at the window like doubt trying to get in. She sat on her prayer mat and whispered, "Ya Allah, I'm scared, but I know you don't ask for strength first. You give it later." Then she wrote in her journal, "If the law says I can't wear this cloth because it offends someone's eyes, maybe the real problem isn't my head. It's their heart." The next day, the school held an inclusivity assembly. They spoke about diversity. They invited students from multiple backgrounds to talk about belonging. They didn't invite Amira. She watched the live stream at home, sipping tea in silence. The stage was filled with students clapping for ideals that didn't exist when she needed them. Later that night, she received a message on social media from someone anonymous. It simply said, "I don't wear the hijab, but I've never been prouder of someone who does." It wasn't signed, but it stayed with her longer than the threats. By Friday, she was on the national news. Again. This time her name was trending. This time she wasn't the girl who wore the hijab. She was the girl who sued the state. But in her heart, she hadn't changed. She wasn't a symbol. She wasn't a martyr. She wasn't even angry. She just wanted to go back to school and walk through the front doors without choosing between her future and her faith. It was a quiet knock at the door that changed everything. Not from a journalist, not from the court, from Jonas Cohen, the Jewish boy in her literature class who barely spoke a word all semester. He stood outside with his backpack slung low and a folded paper in his hand. "I won't stay," he said quickly. "Just wanted you to have this." He handed her the note and walked away before she could respond. Inside, Amira unfolded it. It was handwritten, a little shaky. "They told me I'll have to stop wearing my yarmulke if your case fails. I never thought our faiths had anything in common. I was wrong. If you're standing, I'm standing." Amira read it twice, her fingers gripping the page like a lifeline. It wasn't loud. It wasn't viral. It was just a line between two students who suddenly understood each other in silence. That weekend, another message arrived. This time from Sophia, a Catholic girl 2 years older who hadn't spoken to Amira since middle school. She messaged, "They stopped letting us bring our rosaries." Quietly, without policy, just pressure. They never said it out loud, but it's happening. "I wish I had your courage." Amira didn't feel courageous. She felt exhausted, but something inside her shifted. This wasn't just about her scarf. It was about everyone who had been made to believe that modesty is suspicion, that worship is disruption, that faith has a dress code, and neutrality is white and uncovered. They weren't just watching now, they were remembering. Mr. Keller called her the next morning. "We've received letters from human rights groups across Europe. Your case is being reviewed at the national level. This could go constitutional." Amira blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means the whole country is watching. And if you win, the law changes for everyone. She sat back silent. Her mother brought her tea and sat beside her. Are you ready for that? Amira looked down at her hijab fingers, adjusting the seam near her cheek. I didn't ask for this, she said. I just didn't want to lie to God to sit in a classroom. Her mother smiled faintly. That's how most change begins, with someone who just tells the truth, even when it's expensive. At school, students whispered again, but now it was different. A few nodded at her. One girl walked by and gave her a folded sticky note that said, "You're not alone." Even the teachers grew quiet around her. Some offered awkward smiles. One left a Qur'an quote scribbled gently in the margin of her homework. With hardship comes ease. 94. 6. Amira didn't seek attention. She walked through the halls like a shadow, calm, measured. But her footsteps left marks in places where silence used to rule. One afternoon, she stopped by the masjid. The imam handed her a letter from a woman she didn't know. It said, I removed my hijab 10 years ago. I thought it would make my life easier. It did, but it made my soul quieter too. Watching you reminded me that peace doesn't come from blending in. It comes from standing up even when your voice is covered. Amira folded the letter slowly, and for the first time since the trial began, she didn't feel like she was walking towards something terrifying. She felt like she was walking towards something true. The courtroom was full, not just with people, but with weight. Cameras were banned, but everyone knew this moment would echo. Law students leaned forward in the gallery. A group of students held small notebooks scribbling silently. 2 ministers sat in the back row. Even the bailiff stood straighter. Amira sat in the center. Her lawyer, Mr. Keller, whispered instructions, but she barely heard them. Her heart was loud, not from fear, but from dhikr. She had been reciting silently since morning, Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakil. Allah is sufficient for us, and He is the best disposer of affairs. The state prosecutor cleared his throat, pacing. She is not being punished for her faith, he declared, but for placing it above public policy. The state must remain religiously neutral. That includes our classrooms. We ask this court to uphold the law, not to bend it for cultural exceptions. He turned to Amira, hands folded behind his back. This is not about banning faith. It is about maintaining unity. Then he sat down. Silence. The judge turned to Amira. Miss Rahman, would you like to speak? She stood slowly, not nervously, deliberately. Her hijab was navy today, pressed elegant, peaceful. Her voice when it came was steady. Your Honor, I was not hiding. Her words fell like rain into dry silence. I did not wear this scarf to rebel or to resist or to divide. I wore it because I believe that what I cover belongs to God, not the state. Somewhere in the gallery, a pen stopped mid-scratch. She continued, I have been told I am a symbol, that I'm being used. But no one used me when I tied my first hijab at age 12. No one pressured me when I stood in front of a mirror and whispered Bismillah because I was nervous to walk outside. That was between me and my Creator. She paused, her breath calm. Then I didn't challenge this law because I wanted attention. I challenged it because one morning I was told I couldn't sit in a classroom unless I uncovered my conviction. Her eyes met the judge's. Your Honor, I wasn't hiding. I was remembering that I am more than my hair, more than my skin, that I am not what this society wants to sell or show or soften. She looked out at the gallery now, straight at them. You say you want unity, but forcing everyone to look the same is not unity, it's erasure. Another pause. And then softer. I love this country. I grew up here. I speak your language, eat your food, sing your anthem. But if you tell me I must become invisible to be accepted, then the Constitution is no longer protecting me. It's warning me. The room was still. She bowed her head. That's all. She sat down. Mr. Keller didn't speak. He didn't need to. No one clapped. But something unspoken had shifted. The judge blinked slowly, leaned back in his chair and quietly said, This court will take the matter under consideration. And then adjourned. As people rose to leave, no one spoke. Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside, hearts were still soaked with something they couldn't name. Because in that room, for the first time, a courtroom had witnessed not defiance, but devotion. The city was quieter the next morning. No breaking headlines. No interview requests. No noise. And for the first time in weeks, Amira allowed herself to walk without destination. Past the law office, past the courthouse, down cobbled streets, she used to take on the way to the library. Her phone buzzed endlessly in her pocket, messages, news alerts, well-meaning voices. But she didn't open any of them. She just kept walking. It was still early when she reached the park, the same one she had sat in the day she was suspended. This time the trees were blooming, gentle white petals trembling under a soft spring breeze. She found an empty bench near the old fountain and sat down. For the first time since the trial began, she exhaled. The wind nudged her scarf gently. The sound of birdsong mingled with distant traffic. And for a brief moment she felt like a girl again. Not a headline, not a plaintiff, not a case number. Just Amira. She pulled out her small journal and opened to a blank page. Her pen hovered. Ya Allah, she thought I did everything I could. It's in your hands now. A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. You don't see many girls wearing it anymore, the woman said. Amira looked up. An older woman stood nearby, wrapped in a long gray coat, her white hair tucked beneath a knitted cap. She smiled kindly and gestured to the hijab. I used to wear something like that too, the woman said as she slowly lowered herself onto the bench beside her. Back in the 60s, Catholic boarding school. It was called a mantilla. Amira blinked. Really, the woman chuckled. Of course, we wore it to mass. It made me feel held, like I was doing something sacred. But over time, they told us it was old-fashioned, outdated, political. Her smile faded slightly, so I took it off. A pause settled between them. Did it help? Amira asked softly. The woman looked down at her hands. It helped people stop staring, she said. But it didn't help me feel more free. They sat in silence for a while. You're very brave, you know, the woman said, to keep something sacred when the world's trying to tear it off. I'm not brave, Amira said. Just tired of pretending obedience is a threat. The woman nodded slowly, then reached into her purse and pulled out a wrapped chocolate. For sweetness, she smiled. Amira accepted it with a quiet thank you. She looked at the wrapper, then back at the woman. I never caught your name. Doesn't matter, she said with a wink. Just know that some of us remember what it felt like to cover not out of fear, but out of faith. As the woman stood to leave, she paused. Don't ever let them convince you it's strange to be devout, she said. It's not strange. It's rare. Then she walked away, disappearing into the soft hush of morning. Amira sat alone again, but somehow, not alone. She opened her journal and wrote, Truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits beside you on a bench and reminds you, you're not crazy for being loyal to God when the world is loyal to itself. She closed the book and smiled. The morning of the decision, the courthouse was surrounded again, this time, not by shouting protesters, but by silence. A kind of tense reverence. People stood in lines outside the steps. Elderly couples, teenagers in school uniforms, journalists with their pens down. Some wore scarves, some wore pins, some wore nothing to show sides at all, but their eyes were waiting. Amira stood beside Mr. Keller, just outside the courtroom doors, heart steady. She had already prayed Fajr, already whispered Bismillah before tying her hijab. Whatever came next, she had made her peace. She wasn't here to be celebrated. She was here to witness what truth might still live in the bones of a nation. Inside the chamber was full. No cameras, no interviews. Just paper wood breath and a judge with more years behind him than ahead. He read slowly from the ruling. In the matter of Amira Rahman versus the State Department of Education, this court finds that the enforced hijab restriction violates Article 9 of the National Constitution, namely the right to manifest one's religion in public without undue interference. People didn't gasp. They didn't cheer. They listened. While the state may pursue secular policy, it may not do so at the expense of individual conscience. The hijab is not a threat. It is a form of religious expression. To ban it is to silence faith. The judge set down the papers and looked up, his voice softer now. This court rules in favor of the plaintiff. Mr. Keller exhaled. Amira stood still, her hands folded gently. It was done. The courtroom buzzed. Reporters scrambled to write, though no one shouted. It wasn't a moment for volume. It was a moment for dignity. Outside, a few people began to clap, slowly, hesitantly, but it grew. Not like a victory parade, like a prayer answered. Mr. Keller turned to her. "Do you want to speak to the press?" Amira shook her head. "No, let them speak now." She stepped outside into the gray morning light. The crowd parted without prompting. A quiet hush fell again. A young girl stepped forward, maybe 13, her hijab slightly crooked, cheeks red from the cold. She looked up and whispered, "You made space for me." Amira smiled and gently fixed the corner of the girl's scarf. "No, I just reminded them you were already here." That clip, just a girl fixing another girl's hijab, would become the most shared image of the day. When journalists finally caught up to her, one asked breathlessly, "Amira, how does it feel to change the Constitution?" She paused, thought, then said softly, "I didn't change the Constitution. I just asked it to remember me." That line would echo louder than the ruling itself. That evening back at home, her family sat together for the first peaceful meal in weeks. Her mother lit a small candle. Her father brought out a box of sweets. And Amira, before she touched anything, raised her hands in Dua Yallah. Not for victory, but for truth. Not for me, but for every girl after me. Accept it from me. And outside the windows across the country, a law had changed. But more than that, a people had begun to see. The building looked the same brick facade, same green iron gate that creaked slightly when opened, same row of windows where sunlight spilled across the linoleum floors. But when Amira stepped through the entrance of her school again, something had changed. Not the structure, the air. There was no ceremony, no speeches, no dramatic applause, only the soft echo of her footsteps down the familiar hallway, the one she hadn't walked since the day they sent her home. This time she wasn't afraid. She passed by lockers lined with campaign posters and backpacks. Some students turned to look, not with suspicion but with softness. A few nodded. One teacher smiled with misty eyes. She walked straight to her classroom. Her old desk waited in the back corner as if it had missed her. Before she sat down, a voice spoke behind her. "Amira." She turned. It was Eva, her former best friend, the one who'd gone silent during the trial, the girl who hadn't texted since Amira filed her complaint. Eva looked nervous, clutching her books to her chest. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Amira raised her eyebrows slightly. "I didn't know what to do," Eva continued. "My parents, they were scared. I was scared too. But I watched your speech, and I wore a cross necklace today." She pulled it slightly from beneath her sweater. For the first time since 6th grade, Amira gave her a small, knowing smile. "Welcome back," she said. A few moments later, another student stepped into the room, a younger girl maybe a year behind them. Her hijab was loosely tied, slightly crooked, like she'd done it herself for the first time. She spotted Amira and froze. Amira gestured for her to come over. "You look great," she whispered, adjusting the back seam gently. "Tighter here, softer at the chin." The girl exhaled, relieved. "My mom said if you could do it, I could try." "You're not trying," Amira said. "You're doing." Class began. The teacher, a middle-aged man known more for discipline than warmth, walked in and paused when he saw her. For a second, he just stared. Then he nodded. "Welcome back, Miss Rahman." Amira nodded back. "Thank you, sir." He turned to the board. "All right, everyone. New chapter. New day." Later that afternoon, she returned home, dropped her backpack near the door, and sat in the kitchen with her journal. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "They tried to make me choose between my faith and my future, but alhamdulillah, I chose both. And now maybe they'll stop asking girls like me to choose at all." She set the pen down, hearing her mother hum softly while stirring a pot on the stove. The sun dipped below the skyline. Another ordinary day. But deep inside the silence, a truth remained she had not shouted. She had not wavered, and she had not removed her scarf. But through her stillness, her prayer, her courage, a constitution had remembered its soul. And a girl had walked home with her head high, her heart whole, and her hijab untouched. In a world that demands we prove ourselves by shedding what makes us different, Amira reminded us that true strength lies in holding fast to what's sacred, especially when no one else understands it. Her story isn't just about a scarf or a courtroom. It's about what happens when sincerity stands quietly before power and says, "I am not afraid to be faithful." We live in a time where conformity is celebrated and conviction is questioned. But Amira's journey teaches us that obedience to God is not weakness, it is clarity, courage, and dignity. You don't have to shout to make history. You don't have to fight to be free. Sometimes all it takes is one soul who refuses to lie to God for the sake of fitting in. Stand firm in truth. Walk softly in faith, and the world may just follow your footsteps back to justice. They were sent to expose radicalism. Two Western journalists trained to find fear entered a remote desert village, expecting secrecy, tension, maybe danger. But what they found opened doors. Children reciting Qur'an, men praying under the sun with tears, not anger. Then the sandstorm hit, their van destroyed, communications lost, and the villagers, the very people they came to question, risked everything to save them. No sermons, no revenge, just water bread and prayer. One journalist whispered, "We came to uncover them, but they uncovered us instead." What happened out there? What truth can't be filmed, but can transform a soul? If you're ready for a story that was never meant for headlines, press 1. They flew in on assignment, cameras packed tight beside their skepticism. Sarah Barnes had reported from war zones, disaster zones, and front lines that most people only saw from the safety of evening news. She didn't believe in neutrality, she believed in narratives. And this one, she was told, was about religious radicalism brewing quietly in the desert. Daniel, her junior producer, was younger, quieter, and more cautious. He still believed stories could heal things, that truth had layers, that faith, even when strange, didn't always mean danger. Their destination was a remote village tucked between two mountain ranges in North Africa, not far from where foreign aid teams had once been ambushed. The assignment was simple on paper: investigate rumors of a growing ultra-conservative sect. Capture footage, get interviews, send it back in time for a 2-part expose. But something felt off from the moment they arrived. The village didn't match the file. There were no armed guards, no secret gatherings, no hushed warnings. Children ran barefoot between narrow clay alleys. Farmers worked silently in fields that stretched toward the sun. Women in hijabs smiled politely as they passed, carrying baskets of bread or water. No one stared too long. No one asked what they were doing there. Their guide, a young school teacher named Hamid, met them at the edge of the village with a soft grin and fluent English. "We don't get many visitors," he said, helping them with their bags. "But everyone knows why you've come." Sarah glanced at Daniel. "And they're still letting us stay," Hamid shrugged. "Why wouldn't they? We have nothing to hide." That was the first surprise. They were given a small guest house near the masjid, basic but clean. The air was hot and dry, the kind that turns silence into something sacred. That evening, the call to prayer echoed through the hills, a slow, melodic voice that seemed to melt into the earth. Daniel paused, filming for a moment, letting the sound settle. Sarah made a note in her journal. Atmosphere surprisingly calm, not what was briefed. The next day, they began their interviews. The villagers answered every question. No fear, no defensiveness. They spoke about their faith openly, but without spectacle. They talked about prayer, fasting, the prophet, and family. When asked about politics, they gently declined. "We don't govern," one man said. "We just live." Sarah probed harder. "What about extremism, isolation, anti-Western sentiment?" The old man simply smiled. "You're asking about shadows we don't chase. We're chasing light." That line lingered longer than Sarah wanted to admit. That Friday, they witnessed something she couldn't explain. As the sun climbed to its peak, the village grew quiet. Doors closed, stalls shut. Even the animals seemed to settle. Sarah followed Hamid through the winding paths until they reached a wide clearing at the village's edge. Dozens of men stood shoulder to shoulder on the sand, some in worn robes, some in shirts and jeans lined in rows. There was no podium, no loudspeaker, just a single man standing at the front. Then they bowed, in perfect silence, and when their foreheads touched the earth, something in Sarah's chest shifted. She didn't know why, she didn't understand the words, but for a moment under the blazing desert sun, she envied them, not because of what they believed, but because of how completely they seemed to belong. Daniel beside her lowered his camera. Neither of them spoke. There was no breaking news, no scandal, no headline, just stillness. And in that stillness, the real story had begun. Sarah was frustrated, not visibly, not in front of the camera, But internally, beneath the skin of her practiced professionalism, she could feel it growing in irritation she couldn't name. 3 days in and there was still no angle. No fuel, no controversy. The people were too calm, too quiet, too faithful. She had asked every variation of every hard question, and still they responded with patience, humility, and a kind of sincerity that felt unreal. They didn't dodge her. They didn't argue. They simply answered as if they had nothing to defend. Daniel, on the other hand, was changing. She noticed it in the way he slowed down between shots, how he stopped asking about the schedule and started asking about the people. He lingered in the school courtyard, filming the children reciting verses from memory, with voices so pure they made even the dust seem sacred. He had started leaving his equipment off when they visited homes for meals. He said it didn't feel right to point a lens at kindness. Sarah watched him grow softer by the hour. It annoyed her more than she wanted to admit. That evening after filming, they were invited to dinner at Hamid's home. The table was low, the food simple: lentils, flatbread dates, and goat stew. No fancy presentations, no cameras, just hands in shared bowls. Hamid's mother served without speaking much. His father, an old man with a white beard and weathered hands, smiled warmly and said Bismillah before they began. Sarah hesitated, unsure whether to mimic or sit silent. Daniel whispered, "Just eat. No one's judging." She did. As they ate, Hamid's younger brother, barely 13, asked them questions. Not about politics or faith, but about New York cold weather, tall buildings, and why people in the West always seem in such a hurry. Sarah offered polite answers, but her mind wasn't in the room. That night she lay in bed exhausted and restless. The walls were thin, and from the room next door she heard it again, the voice of someone reciting Qur'an. Slow, steady, rhythmic, like water dripping through a cracked ceiling into a place she didn't know she had. She closed her eyes trying to block it out. It only made it louder. The next morning she sat with Hamid outside the masjid as the sun rose. "Why does everyone here trust us so easily?" she asked. He smiled. "Because we trust Allah more than we fear people." Sarah frowned. "You know why we're here." "I do, and you're not worried we'll misrepresent you." Hamid shrugged. "That's between you and God." She stared at him. "That's it." He nodded, then pointed to the desert beyond. "You're looking for fire, but this place is all wind and water. It breaks people slowly. Not with drama, but with truth." She didn't respond. Later that day, the winds picked up. Dust blew across the narrow roads. Locals began securing windows and rolling up carpets. A storm was coming. One of the elders warned them to pack and leave early. "The desert doesn't wait," he said. Sarah disagreed. "No, we stay. The story we're waiting for, this is it." Daniel looked uneasy. "We've already got a story." "No," she said firmly. "We have details, footage, atmosphere, but not truth. Not yet." He hesitated. "What if the truth isn't what we came for?" She didn't answer, but deep inside she felt it too. Something was shifting, and if the storm didn't reveal it, something else would. The sky turned orange before it turned black. It began with a whisper, loose grains of sand carried by a breeze that stung the skin. Locals moved quickly, quietly. Doors were latched, livestock herded, water jugs filled. No one screamed, no one ran. They had seen it before. Sarah stood in the middle of the village square, shielding her eyes, staring at the approaching wall of dust. "We need to get footage of this," she said, adjusting the lens cap on her camera. "This is the story." "Look at that sky." Daniel hesitated. "We should go back." Hamid said to stay indoors. "Just 10 more minutes," Sarah insisted, voice raised over the wind. "We're not running from a little sand." But it wasn't little, and it wasn't just sand. The wind howled within minutes. The sunlight vanished. It became hard to see more than a few feet ahead. When the first wave of the storm hit, it came like a curtain, thick, choking, alive. The sand coated their clothes, their eyes, their mouths. Cameras jammed, lenses cracked. Their gear was suddenly dead weight. Daniel grabbed Sarah's arm. "We can't see. We need to go now." They stumbled blindly through the gusts, bent low, coughing. The village that had felt so open just hours ago now felt like a maze of wind and grit. Visibility dropped to nothing. Every alley looked the same. Every breath carried heat and dirt. Then hands. rough but careful, pulling them into a doorway, slamming it shut. It was Hamid's father. Without a word, he guided them into a small room lit by a single oil lamp. The walls were lined with blankets to keep out the dust. There was already tea brewing in a corner, as if he had been expecting them. Daniel collapsed into the corner, breathless, wiping his face with his sleeve. Sarah stood stunned, the camera dangling uselessly by her side. Hamid's mother brought them wet cloths, dates, water, no questions, no judgment, just care. Sarah's throat tightened. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her voice low, almost accusing. Hamid's father looked at her gently. "Because our prophet taught us that when a guest is in need, we serve them before ourselves." Sarah didn't speak. She couldn't. The storm outside roared louder. The roof creaked. The lamp flickered. Yet somehow inside that room there was peace. Later that evening, as the worst of the storm passed, Hamid led them out into the open again. The village was covered in dust, but it was still standing. People were sweeping sand from their doorways, sharing what little food remained, checking on one another. Then from across the square, a line of men began forming quietly, deliberately, shoulder to shoulder. Sarah recognized them. The same prayer she had seen before was about to begin again. But this time, it was different. They stood under a sky still thick with dust, the horizon dim with storm clouds. No microphones. No warnings, just the imam's voice, soft and steady, calling them to prayer. And one by one, the villagers bowed, then knelt, then pressed their foreheads to the earth. Sarah watched unmoving. Daniel didn't raise his camera. There was no audience, no performance, just submission, just trust, just prayer in the heart of a storm. And something inside her, something she'd built her whole career protecting, began to crack. Not from fear, from truth. The storm passed, but something deeper lingered. The village had weathered it like they weathered everything else, quietly with dignity. The sand was swept from the doorways. Cracked pottery was mended. Even laughter returned to the alleyways. But for Sarah and Daniel, the wind had stripped away more than just visibility. It had blown open something within them, something they weren't yet ready to name. The satellite van remained buried. Their communications equipment was still dead. Rescue teams weren't coming for days. Hamid told them gently, "You're welcome to stay. There's food, water, and shade. And perhaps you'll learn something else." That morning, a new silence settled over the village. No breakfast, no smoke from kitchens, no midday cooking. When Sarah asked why, Hamid smiled and said, "We're fasting. Ramadan began last night." Sarah furrowed her brow. "But after the storm, after everything you lost," Hamid nodded. "Especially after the storm." Daniel asked if they were supposed to join, and Hamid responded gently, "Only if your heart wants to, not your stomach." Out of respect or curiosity, they both chose not to eat. By noon, Sarah's head throbbed. Her mouth was dry. Daniel was faring slightly better, but they both moved slowly, careful not to complain. The villagers offered them shade and rest, but no pity. Everyone fasted together, young, old, poor, content. There was no virtue made of it, just endurance and gratitude. That afternoon, they sat with a group of women weaving baskets beneath a fig tree. One of them, an elderly woman with sun-wrinkled hands, told them how her husband died during the war protecting Christian aid workers from a rogue militia. "He didn't die for politics," she said. "He died doing what Allah loved." Sarah listened, speechless. Later, they joined a circle of boys around the village's only Qur'an teacher. The children recited from memory with smiles on their faces, like every verse was a treasure being unwrapped. When Daniel asked how they remembered so much, the teacher replied, "Because the words live in our hearts longer than they live in our mouths." There was no tension, no extremism, no bitterness. Just faith rooted, lived, and alive. As the sun set, the azan echoed once again. Dates were passed around. Water poured, bread broken. No one rushed, no one hoarded. They waited for the imam to say Bismillah, and then they ate. Sarah tasted the first bite of bread like it was sacred. She couldn't explain why she felt tears behind her eyes. She only knew that the silence between these people was more truthful than the noise of the world she'd left behind. After the meal, she sat alone on a low stone wall, staring into the dusk. The sand still clung to the corners of her notebook. The camera remained unused by her side. Hamid walked over, sat without speaking. She turned to him after a while. "Why does everything feel so "Steady here," he replied, "because we don't chase peace. We remember it." That night, for the first time, Sarah joined the villagers as they stood for prayer. She didn't pray. She didn't know how. She didn't even pretend. She just stood there, beside them, still, watching, and for once not trying to report the story, just letting it reach her. When the sand finally settled, the van was found half buried near the outskirts of the village, its tires swallowed by the earth. It took hours to dig it out, but with help from the locals, Sarah and Daniel eventually dragged it back under the shade of an old acacia tree. The equipment inside, however, wasn't so lucky. The drives were fried, the cameras scratched and filled with fine sand. What hadn't been destroyed was unusable footage, corrupted interviews, erased audio warped by the wind. Days of work gone swallowed by the storm like it had never existed. Sarah stared at the blank screens in disbelief. This wasn't just a technical failure. It was a collapse of the entire project. No data, no sound bites, no evidence, nothing to bring home, nothing to prove she had been right or wrong. For a moment, she felt an old reflex rise inside her panic. Deadlines, editors, career damage, the shame of returning empty-handed. But then quietly, something else rose to the surface, something that surprised her. Relief. She looked up from the wreckage and saw the village not through the lens, but as it really was. Children laughing in the dusty paths, women sitting under trees sewing and humming, men returning from the fields, their faces lined with sun and contentment. She realized she had never needed a camera to capture this place, because what mattered here could not be filmed. That afternoon, Daniel handed her a small notebook. He had been scribbling in it every night since the storm. "I don't think this was ever supposed to be a documentary," he said softly. "I think it was supposed to be a reminder." Sarah flipped through it, sketches of the masjid phrases he'd picked up, reflections written like prayers. He wasn't a religious man, but something in his writing sounded like reverence. They sat in silence beneath the tree, the broken van behind them, the call to prayer drifting in from the village again, like a memory they hadn't earned, but had been gifted anyway. Sarah didn't take notes. She didn't plan her next move. She just watched the sun settle on the rooftops, gold and forgiving. That night, as the village gathered again to break their fast, a young girl walked over to Sarah and pressed a small folded piece of paper into her hand. Inside was a verse handwritten in Arabic and English. "Whoever saves one life, it is as if they have saved all of humanity." Qur'an 5:32. Sarah's breath caught. She looked up, but the girl had already rejoined her family. Later in her room, Sarah placed the note inside her journal. Not as a quote, not as a story hook, as a truth she didn't want to lose. Daniel didn't pick up the camera once that evening. Instead, he stood at the back of the masjid courtyard, eyes closed, lips moving silently, not with a prayer he had memorized, but with something his soul seemed to be finding on its own. The desert hadn't given them what they came for. It had given them something better. Not footage, not headlines, but a crack in the wall they had built between themselves and what was sacred. And in that crack, something real had finally entered. The plane touched down just after sunrise, wheels hissing across the tarmac like a final exhale. Sarah and Daniel sat in silence as the terminal came into view. No fanfare, no applause. Just another flight completed, another assignment closed, at least that's what their editors would think. Back in the office, fluorescent lights replaced candle flames. Buzzing phones replaced birdsong. Screens flickered. Deadlines loomed. The world they had left behind was waiting hungry for content. Sarah placed her damaged camera on the desk. Daniel followed with a laptop that barely turned on. The newsroom director, a fast-talking man in a blue blazer, entered, briskly glancing at the equipment with a frown. So he said, "Where's the footage?" "The files." Sarah stood straight. "It's gone." He blinked. "All of it." "The storm destroyed everything," Daniel added quietly. There was a long pause. Then the director sighed. "Okay, fine. You've still got the story. You lived it. You saw it. Just write what we need. Find the angle. You know, faith in the margins, extremism in plain sight, rural religion meets Western lens, something that sells." Sarah stared at him. She saw the headlines forming behind his eyes, the words twisting into fear, suspicion, profit. She thought of Hamid's father offering water in the dark, of children whispering Qur'an as the wind howled, of the prayer that continued even as the sky collapsed. "No," she said simply. The director looked up. "Excuse me, we're not doing that," she repeated. "There's no scandal, no fear to sell, just people living quietly with more faith than we've ever understood." His jaw clenched. "So what exactly do you expect me to print, a truth you're not used to?" Daniel said. The director laughed bitterly. "You think our readers want a bedtime story about pious villagers and dusty sunsets?" Sarah picked up her journal from her bag. She opened it to the last entry, then looked him in the eye. "We didn't find hatred," she said. "We found humanity. And I'm not going to betray that for ratings." He stepped back, arms crossed. "You're choosing sentiment over story." "I'm choosing honesty," she said. There was a beat of silence. Then Sarah placed her press badge on the desk. "I'm done." Daniel hesitated for only a moment, then did the same. They walked out without fanfare. No one clapped. No one asked where they were going. But something in the air felt lighter as the doors closed behind them. 2 days later, a personal essay appeared online under a small independent outlet. The title was simple: Prayers in the Desert. It had no images, no clickbait, no comments enabled, just words. A quiet retelling of dust and kindness of prayer during a sandstorm of strangers who became brothers without ever asking for anything in return. It didn't go viral. It went inward. People read it in silence, forwarded it to friends with messages like, "You need to feel this." And somewhere in a village far across the sand, someone lit a lamp in the dark, not knowing that their peace had echoed halfway around the world. A year had passed, but the desert had never really left them. It clung to the edges of their thoughts like fine sand, in the seams of a coat, unshakable quiet, and always there. Sarah no longer worked in the newsroom. She didn't chase breaking news or compete for deadlines. She had left the noise behind willingly, without regret. She now lived in a smaller city far from the chaos of deadlines and camera lights. She taught journalism part-time and wrote when it felt honest, not when it was required. Most of her days were slower now, filled with reading, long walks, and silences that no longer scared her. But every Friday, she returned to something deeper. There was a small masjid not far from her apartment, tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. No minaret, no signboard, just a green door and a soft carpet that always smelled faintly of olive oil and old paper. She never went inside for prayer, she wasn't Muslim, but she would sit on the bench outside listening. Sometimes she'd bring a notebook and write. Sometimes she'd just sit and let the recitation wash over her, like a breeze from a place she could still see when she closed her eyes. The imam had stopped asking questions. He just nodded at her now every week, as if he understood that whatever she was searching for, she was already close. Daniel had changed too. He had moved overseas to work on community media projects in refugee camps. He taught kids how to use microphones, helped women record oral histories, and quietly began learning Arabic, not to report on people anymore, but to understand them. They still spoke often. Not about the job they left, but the village they'd found. They never called it by name. It didn't need one. One day while cleaning out her closet, Sarah found the notebook from the trip. The pages were weathered, corners curled. Tucked between 2 pages was the note from the little girl, the Quranic verse written in careful script. "Whoever saves one life, it is as if they have saved all of mankind." She stared at it for a long time, not reading it, just remembering. She closed the notebook slowly and placed it on her desk. That evening she returned to the masjid as usual. It was just after sunset and the streets were lit gold by the last of the light. She sat on the bench as always, but this time, something was different. She didn't want to just listen, she wanted to be near it. When the door opened, she stood and stepped inside. The prayer was already in motion. She didn't join the rows, didn't kneel or bow. She simply stood at the back, hands clasped quietly, watching a room full of strangers speak to their Creator, not with fear or urgency, but with intimacy. She didn't understand the Arabic, but she understood the peace, and it was enough. As they finished, the imam raised his hands in dua, his voice soft. Sarah closed her eyes. She didn't pray, but she listened as if the words were being spoken to her, because in some way they were. When she stepped back into the street, the wind brushed her face like a familiar voice. She smiled to herself, not because she had found all the answers, but because she no longer needed to. The prayer had stayed, not in the footage, not in the file, but in the quiet part of her soul that had once watched men bow in a storm and wanted to understand why. They came with questions, but they left with silence. Not the kind of silence that hides answers, but the kind that becomes one. In a village with no headlines, no hashtags, they found people who prayed through storms, welcomed strangers without suspicion, and taught faith not by preaching, but by living. And somewhere between the wind and the whisper of Qur'an, their own walls began to fall. Because sometimes the story you're sent to tell isn't the story that needs to be told. Sometimes it's the one that changes you instead. So if this story lingered in your heart, if something in it made you pause, then perhaps that too was a kind of prayer.